Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Ambassador Desker, and it has been a great pleasure to spend this week in Singapore. I have visited Singapore before, but twice in my job as Assistant Secretary for Political Military Affairs, and indeed once almost 20 years ago when I had graduated from law and grad school and was backpacking through Southeast Asia. On each of those visits, I only stayed a day or two. So it's been a great pleasure to spend the past week in Singapore and get to know this wonderful place so much better. The title of my talk is Security Cooperation in U.S. Foreign Policy, and indeed it is timely in that my lecture takes place the same week of the Singapore Air Show, where we had one of the largest U.S. delegations, official delegations, in recent years attend. And it demonstrates some of the points that I'm about to make. And again, I want to thank the RSIS for hosting me this past week and for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today. Now, I'm going to try and make sure that I can figure out how to use this. Oops, did I go too far? Okay, so in today's talk, I want to talk about several topics. First, I want to talk about what are we trying to accomplish, the United States trying to accomplish when it engages in security cooperation in support of its geopolitical goals. Then I'm going to talk about using security cooperation to strengthen diplomatic relationships and long-term security partnerships. Then I'll talk a bit about it's not just about arms sales, training and exercises. I'll note some recent changes in the way the U.S. approaches its arms transfers through a recently issued conventional arms transfer policy and recent progress on export control reform. So that'll lay the groundwork for then talking about how do we apply security cooperation policy to Asia. And I will talk about the foundation of the U.S. pivot to Asia, or rebalance, depending on your preference. Talk about how the pivot is actually worked in practice. And then finally talk about how U.S. security relationships in the region are being pursued to support U.S. foreign policy and national security interests. So the chapeau under which we consider security cooperation and assistance in support of U.S. geopolitical goals. We have here a couple of quotes from Secretary Clinton and Secretary Gates. Secretary Clinton said in an article called The Art of Smart Power that building coalitions for common action is becoming both more complicated and more crucial. And then Secretary Gates, in his Foreign Affairs article, said that strategic reality demands that the U.S. government get better at building partner capacity. So if we want to help our partners do more, particularly in an era of greater budget pressure, we need to figure out how to help them do more. And that can take a number of different forms. It can take the form of arms sales. It can take the form of training. It can take the form of joint exercises, and I'll go into each in this lecture. The U.S. approach to security cooperation has changed since the end of the Cold War. In the Cold War, we had a bipolar world where we were seeking to support our partners in the global struggle against communism and the Soviet Union. Now, we live in a different world. We are seeking to help a number of partners react to a number of different security contexts. For example, counterterrorism. It's an issue that countries around the world are focused on, and which requires certain niche capabilities in order to be prepared for. Maritime security, an issue that's incredibly important in this part of the world, providing our partners with tools to promote maritime domain awareness and to be able to protect their vital shipping lines and ships. Drug trafficking, also an area where tools are necessary to prevent this transnational threat. There's also, we want to help our partners work with us to face common security challenges. And the benefit of security, providing our partners with those tools, is that they're more interoperable with us. They can work with us. And it also enables them to share more of the burden in joint operations. And again, in an era when U.S. defense budgets are going to be pressured, this becomes more important than ever. But this is more than just about providing these capabilities for the counterterrorism or drug trafficking or maritime security. Security cooperation is about building long-term partnerships. Security is, at its core, one of the most important functions that a government can provide to its people. If you can help a government with its security issues, you are helping them with their core national security interest. Therefore, it's a critical part of the relationship with a foreign country. For the United States, we view it as an investment in a long-term relationship. When the United States engages in a government-to-government sale, what we call a foreign military sale, we include a whole package: training and support, maintenance, updates, and modernization. And for platforms like fighter aircraft, this can be a 40-year process. And the analogy I like to give is to a smartphone. When you buy a smartphone, you're not just buying the piece of hardware. You're buying the operating system, and you're buying access to a certain type of app. So if you're buying an Apple phone, you'll go to the Apple store. You're not going to go to the Google Android store. If you buy a Google Android, you're not going to go to the Apple store. So you're locking yourself in to the offerings that hardware manufacturer is able to provide you. Well, it's the same thing in aircraft. When you buy a U.S. aircraft, you're going to need U.S. systems to run that aircraft. And an aircraft is a platform that you want to use for decades. So when a country such as Singapore or Japan or Korea buys a U.S. aircraft, they are in fact guaranteeing a decades-long relationship with the United States. From the U.S. perspective, and I think also from our partners' perspective, this has an added value more than just the equipment. It helps to build personal and organizational relationships, and it can help smooth bilateral bumps. So at the end of the day, arms sales are a tool of diplomacy. And that's why in the U.S. system, arms sales are ultimately approved by the Secretary of State. And my bureau at the State Department, the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs, was the bureau responsible for implementing the Secretary of State's authority. In the United States, very often we have the media will cover a sale and say, well, the Pentagon is selling it. And that's actually not true. It's the U.S. government that is selling it, and it is the Secretary of State approving the sale, and it's then implemented by the Pentagon. And so ultimately, it highlights the importance that these sales are foreign policy decisions, which take into account a wide variety of factors before a decision is made to move forward with the sale. Beyond sales, there's other ways in which the United States engages in security cooperation. There is U.S.-provided training and exercises that support state and regional security. There's the International Military Education and Training Program. And this is often a way in for the United States to engage with countries which it may not have a long history. So, for example, you often see countries in Africa where we're using our IMET funds to train, to provide military education and training, sometimes even English language training, in order to be able to better work with us. There's the Global Peace Operations Initiative, or GPOI, which is designed to help fund peacekeeping training around the world. And again, peacekeeping is a joint interest between the country receiving the training and the United States. If there are more well-trained peacekeepers available, it means that the United States is less likely to need to get involved. At the same time, peacekeeping training is often an opportunity for countries to develop professional militaries and gain more experience in international operations. One of the areas where my bureau provided funding was in the help removing landmines or securing manpads. And again, these are areas which are, if you're a country that has remnants of war, these can be damaging to your civilian population or to your security. So the U.S. assistance can help build ties that are important to the security of your population. And indeed, one of the first areas of cooperation that we had with Vietnam was through discussions about how to remove landmines and other exploded devices in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Exercises are also an important part of security cooperation. In Asia, we have the Rim of the Pacific exercise, RIMPAC, and the 2012 exercise included a large number of countries, including Australia, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, New Zealand, Korea, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Chile. Cobra Gold, which is hosted by Thailand. Balika Katan in the Philippines, and Keed Soar and Keen Edge in Japan. And again, these are all ways for the U.S. to interact with its partners. Just a few weeks ago, the United States announced a change, an updated version of its conventional arms transfer policy. It was signed by the President as a presidential policy directive, and it lays out the process and criteria the U.S. uses in export decisions. When I was Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs, the memos that would come to my desk asking me to approve an arms sale would often make reference to the elements of the conventional arms transfer policy that these arms sales supported. Eventually, I asked for a copy of the arms sales policy to make sure that I understood how it was being applied. And it turned out that the policy had not been updated since 1995. And so it was filled with terminology related to the end of the Cold War. So we engaged in a process to update that policy and to make it more relevant to today in the aftermath of the Arab Spring and changes in geopolitics in Asia and elsewhere. The new conventional arms transfer policy has two fundamental tenets: to meet the security needs of allies and to promote the restraint of systems that are destabilizing or dangerous to international peace and security. And that means you have to strike a balance. You want to provide the partners with the tools they need, but you also don't want those very sales to lead to a more unstable security situation. This new policy also highlights the importance of human rights, international stability, homeland security, counterterrorism, combating organized crime, and supporting nonproliferation. The U.S. has also been engaged for the last 2 years in reforming its export control efforts. The export control reform system was drafted during the Cold War, designed to prevent the leakage of sensitive technologies to the Soviet Union. And later, there's been a much greater emphasis on preventing it from going to either states that support terrorism or states that we are concerned about having access to our most sensitive technologies. However, what ended up happening is that even the nut or screw that was being used in, for example, a fighter aircraft ended up needing a license under the definitions that were laid out. When I was Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs, the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls processed a record number of licenses, over 85,000 licenses in a single year. Secretary Gates and others, based on a study by the National Academy of Sciences, said that this is a waste of resources. Most of the licenses coming through were just sailing through. But because of the law and regulations, they needed to get a license. So an export control reform effort began to shift the items that need less protection to the Commerce Department, which has a different regulatory regime, which makes it a bit easier to export and doesn't have some of the onerous regulations and requirements of the United States munitions list. As Secretary Gates put it, it was building higher walls around fewer things, ensuring that we were protecting what really needed to be protecting and focusing on those and allowing those things that were less sensitive to be more easily exported, particularly to partners and allies. So what you may find is at the end of this process, despite the fact that fewer licenses need to be processed, those that do need to be processed may take a little longer because they're really the most sensitive technical issues. Under this new system, if it's on the Commerce Control List and it's going to a government end user who has signed all 4 of the non-proliferation regimes, you don't need a license, which will make it much easier to work with our partners and allies. Another element of the element has been to expand enforcement. If we want to make sure that these things don't end up in the wrong hands, we need to beef up the enforcement. And the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the Department of Commerce Export Enforcement Center, and the Export Enforcement Coordination Center have all been involved in this effort. The final piece of export control reform has been to improve the information technology so that agencies can talk to each other. And there's a new software system that's being put in place at the State Department and Commerce Department, which is based on the Defense Department system. And we anticipate that this will lead to greater ability of U.S. defense contractors and particularly their components makers to be able to compete in the international market, but also to provide our partners with the equipment that they need with much less fuss and much less requirement. And again, this is all part of the rubric of helping our partners get the tools that they need. So that's sort of the framework under which U.S. policy considers security cooperation. Again, it's in pursuit of foreign policy goals. So the question is, how are we applying this in Asia? So I'll spend just a couple of minutes laying out the background of the rebalance or pivot to Asia. You'll notice on the slides that I say pivot, and the reason I do is I originally, when I was in government, adopted the Pentagon's use of rebalance, but then President Obama, during the 2012 presidential debates, referred to it as a pivot. And from what I understand, he likes that term. So I've chosen to use the term as well in these comments. But I think both terms are applicable. So the term pivot, as you know, was first debuted in the foreign policy article, America's Pacific Century, that Secretary Clinton wrote in November 2011. And she used the term, the United States stands at a pivot point. Notice she did not say anywhere in the article this is a pivot to Asia. But it was too catchy a term, and immediately the media and others started referring to a pivot in Asia. But the point that she made in the article is one of the most important tasks of American statecraft over the next decade will therefore be to lock in substantially increased investment, diplomatic, economic, strategic, and otherwise, in the Asia-Pacific region. And while I'm focused on security cooperation in this talk, I do want to emphasize that the pivot is not all about the military. It concerns the diplomatic, economic, and other tasks that Secretary Clinton laid out. Secretary Kerry, also using the term rebalance, said the rebalancing of our foreign policy priorities is neither a work completed nor an effort interrupted. It's a daily march of progress to be measured in miles and years, not yards and days. And Secretary Hagel, again referring to the rebalance, he said the rebalance to the Pacific Asia area that the President announced 2 years ago are based on our common interests with the nation of the Asia-Pacific: trade, commerce, culture, education, stability, security. They'll also help strengthen our capacity and the capacity of our partners in the region. The National Security Strategy, the U.S. Defense Strategy of January 2012, it talks again of the rebalance of the Asia-Pacific region. Our relationships with Asian allies and key partners are critical to the future stability and growth of the region. We will emphasize our existing alliances, which provide a vital foundation for Asia-Pacific security, and also expand our networks of cooperation with emerging partners throughout the Asia-Pacific to ensure collective capacity and capability and capacity for securing common interests. So you see that U.S. government officials have emphasized the importance of the rebalance, and they are, in each of these cases, talking about the importance of security cooperation as an element of the rebalance. So what is the pivot meant in practice? Again, Secretary Clinton's first trip was to Asia. She has attended the ASEAN Regional Forum. Both Secretary Clinton and her counterpart, both First Secretary Gates and Secretary Panetta, each attended all 4 OSMANs during the first term. The President attended the East Asia Summit. They outlining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We saw highest foreign military sales ever. Sales agreements with countries in PACOM rose, and we have increased the amount of FMF and IMED compared to 4 years ago. And we've had visits from, we had Secretary Kerry visits. Previously, we now also, Secretary Kerry is on the road right now in Asia, and we have the announcement of a presidential trip later this spring. Again, the U.S. has been focused on Asia from the principal level, but I think it's also important to note, and I think you'll see this in Quadrennial Defense Review, the National Security Strategy, that the groundwork was laid in the first term to send the signal to the U.S. bureaucracy that there is now a rebalance towards Asia. So there was, the layout of this strategy in Secretary Clinton's article and Secretary Gates' speech and others was during the first term, but you're going to really see the budgets and strategy documents follow in the second term. And I think as we look in the coming months, as more of these documents and budgets come out, I think you'll see that reflected in it. Now I want to talk a little bit about how it's being applied to particular countries in the region. And since we're in Singapore, I'll start with Singapore, which there is a robust security cooperation effort with Singapore. Defense Minister hosted by the SecDef in December. There is the 1990 memorandum of the MOA that allows U.S. ships and aircraft to transit Singaporean bases. There is the rotational deployment of the U.S. Navy Littoral Combat Ship, which began in 2012. In March to June, there will be support from Singapore for CTF 151 in the Gulf of Aden, which is Singapore's 9th rotation since 2009. And then there is FMS, the F-15 Strike Eagle, which is combat ready as of September 2013, and Singapore is expected to upgrade its F-16s. It was notified in January 2014, and there's been some reports that Singapore is seriously considering the F-35 as well. And so again, the security cooperation relationship and both sales and exercises are being used to support the long-term strategic relationship of the United States with Singapore. We see this also reflected throughout Southeast Asia. So the Philippines, a treaty ally. We've now shifted our foreign military financing, which used to be focused on counterterrorism efforts, to maritime security. The Philippines has earmarked funds to acquire frigates. They have received prior excess defense article Coast Guard cutters, and they we are in discussions on how to formalize our efforts to utilize Philippine bases. And there was a 6-day joint military exercise in the South China Sea in June 2013. Again, the Philippines, a treaty ally, they look to the United States to help support their security. And we are doing that both through security assistance as well as joint training and exercises. Thailand, another treaty ally, with which we have a strong security partnership. Cobra Gold has been hosted by the U.S. and Thailand since 1980, and it's the largest such exercise in Asia. And they are a robust foreign military sales customer, having Lakota helicopters were notified to Congress in 2013, and they are looking at their upgrade of their F-16 fleet as well. Indonesia. During President Obama's visit, he announced the excess defense article transfer of F-16s in 2011. It's the largest transfer of defense articles in the history of the U.S.-Indonesia relationship. And the U.S. is also going to sell 8 new Apache attack helicopters, which Secretary Hagel announced in August 2013. So again, these are advances in the relationship in Southeast Asia. And indeed, one of the elements of the pivot or rebalance has not just been a pivot to Asia, but also rebalancing from Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia, as evidenced by some of these announcements, as well as the rotational deployment of Marines to Darwin in Australia. Security relationship with Malaysia, Vietnam, and Burma. For Malaysia, they're going through a modernization effort, which offers large potential for U.S. firms. And so you can see on the slide here that the Royal Malaysian Navy is looking to purchase anti-submarine warfare helicopters. There's a multi-role combat aircraft program and upgrades to C-130 fleet. Secretary Hagel described in August 2013 that the U.S. will conduct more than 75 military activities and exchanges with the Malaysian military. Vietnam. During my time in government, the dialogue with Vietnam expanded, and we have seen non-combat naval exercises, and the next step will be the potential sale of military equipment to Vietnam. Currently, the U.S. allows non-lethal aid, and dependent on the lethal aid will be dependent on human rights improvements. But there are real opportunities, particularly in the area of maritime security, to work with Vietnam. Burma, or Myanmar. The 2013 National Defense Authorization Act calls to thoroughly evaluate the potential for developing military-to-military relations. And so there is a potential for future cooperation with Burma, but at the same time, a lot of that will depend on developments in Burma's politics. Taiwan, key U.S. partner, top recipient of U.S. arms sales. It's ranked 8th among worldwide recipients in 2011. There were 2 major arms sales during the President Obama's first term. $6.4 billion in sales were notified in 2010 and $5.8 billion in 2011. Taiwan's defense budget, there is approximately $10.5 billion. The United States would like to see them spend a bit more of a percentage of GDP on their defense and to reverse the decline in military spending. But at the end of the day, they remain a significant partner of the United States, and arms sales are used as a tool to help develop their capability and also as a demonstration of the U.S. commitment to Taiwan. Australia, another treaty ally. As I mentioned earlier, the U.S. in 2011 announced the deployment of U.S. Marines to Darwin, rotational deployment, and they have been a significant FMS military customer, purchasing the C-17 Globemaster aircraft, MH-60R Seahawks, F-18s, and air-to-air missiles, and others. And they continue to be a significant partner of the United States and a significant customer as well. Japan, and this is an issue that I've been talking about a lot this week. They are a treaty ally. They have a new emphasis on defense, which the United States is trying to strike the right balance. We would like Japan to do more for its own security, but also in a way that's sensitive to the concerns of their neighbors in the region. They have announced that they intend to buy the Joint Strike Fighter. They have bought the Aegis Combat Support System and a number of other capabilities. We are working with them on how to develop. We initiated a cyber dialogue with them, and they are one of the most significant partners of the United States in the Asia-Pacific region. Again, this is an area where the U.S. and Japan have traditionally cooperated quite closely, and that we should expect that to continue, but at the same time to be sensitive to what appearances may be and how partners in the region may react. South Korea. South Korea faces a threat from the north, and there are ongoing threats and issues there. But we have 28,500 troops stationed. We have joint naval drills in the Yellow Sea. And indeed, it's these upcoming drills, which North Korea vehemently objects to, that are always posed a sensitive time in North-South relations. They're in the process of evaluating the Joint Strike Fighter. They've purchased a number of U.S. helicopters. And remember, we're in the process of preparing for OPCON transfer, which means that operational control of forces on the peninsula will move from a U.S. commander to a Korean commander. It was postponed during the first Obama administration, and we should, keep a close eye out as to whether it will proceed as planned or any other issues arise. But certainly, the Pentagon and the South Koreans have been looking closely at that issue. So, as you can see, U.S. efforts in the region are robust. It's a great opportunity for security cooperation, for exercises, and quite frankly, for U.S. industry. But at the end of the day, these decisions are not made for one sole reason, for an economic reason or to help on a particular issue. They take place in a context. They take place in the context of the U.S. focusing more on Asia, of the U.S. rebalancing towards Asia, and of the U.S. using its security cooperation as a foreign policy tool to further deepen the relationships with its Asian partners. At the end of the day, I think you'll see over the coming years that there will be an increased emphasis on these partnerships, along with other emphasis such as trade, economic development, cultural. When you look at the end of President Obama's term, I think that you will see that the security cooperation relationships with each of these partners will have been deepened in support of broader U.S. foreign policy goals. So with that, I've concluded my prepared remarks, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.